The taste of almonds on my tongue was the first warning. Not a flavor I'd chosen, not something I'd touched. I remember the clarity of that moment with the precision. I've spent my entire career perfecting the exact timestamp, when my body began its revolt, when the familiar signals I'd learned to recognize as an adult, living with a severe tree. Nut allergy started their insistent, terrifying progression. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday in October, and I was standing in the private dining room of 11 Madison Park, my hand suspended between a white plate and my mouth, the piece of duck confit catching the light from the geometric fixtures overhead. Around me, Manhattan's elite moved through their choreographed dinner party with the ease of people who'd never worried about their bodies turning against them. I could see the executive vice president of Castellano and Associates across the table, her pearls catching the same light as the duck fat on the china. I could see my sister Margaret, Maggie to everyone who mattered, laughing with the kind of controlled brilliance that made people want to fund her campaigns, elect her candidates, believe in whatever narrative she was constructing that week. I could see my parents at the far end of the table, their faces arranged in that particular expression they'd perfected over decades. Present but somehow elsewhere, proud of Maggie's ascendance, aware that I was there, but not quite registering what I was, or why I'd been invited to what was functionally her triumph. What I couldn't see was the mechanism. Not yet. The body knows before the mind does. Mine knew something was wrong before I understood why. The sensation started as a tightness at the back of my throat, a subtle swelling that I initially registered as anxiety. That was the merciful part of it. That moment of self-doubt, when I wondered if I was imagining the danger. I'm a forensic accountant by profession. I find hidden structures in numbers that other people miss. I'm trained in systems, in evidence, in the architecture of deception. I'm not someone who panics. I'm not someone who misreads danger. But in that first 10 seconds, I doubted myself anyway. Because that's what happens when your body betrays you in front of the people you've spent your entire life trying not to need. I set the fork down, deliberately. The precision of the motion came from muscle memory, from 32 years of managing this particular fragility. There are protocols. There are always protocols. I'd been carrying an EpiPen in my clutch since I was 14 years old. I'd memorized the symptoms. The tightness would progress to swelling. The swelling would progress to asphyxiation. The timeline was usually 15 to 20 minutes if I didn't intervene. I had time. I always had time. The allergy wasn't a death sentence if you were careful, if you were vigilant, if you planned every social interaction around the assumption that the people around you might not be careful enough to remember your fragility. "Are you okay?" Maggie asked, and I heard something in her voice that I recognized. It was the same tone she used when she was hosting a client event and someone's phone rang during the presentation. It was the tone of a woman watching something go off script, watching a detail in her carefully orchestrated narrative become unexpected. Her eyes had a particular shine to them, not concern. Something else. Something that looked like amusement, or maybe anticipation, or maybe something I didn't have words for yet. "Fine," I said. The word came out smaller than I intended. "Just a moment." I stood up. The room was moving, or I was moving through it differently. The sensation in my throat had progressed beyond tightness. It was becoming swelling. I could feel my larynx enlarging, the space for air diminishing. This was past the point of doubt. This was past the point of wondering if I was imagining things. This was the moment when I needed my EpiPen, and I needed it immediately. "Eleanor?" My mother's voice. Concerned now, but with that edge of embarrassment. I was making a scene. I was drawing attention. I was doing the thing I'd been trained from childhood to never do, which was to ask for accommodation, to admit fragility, to make other people adjust their expectations around my medical need. "Bathroom," I managed. Even now, even as my throat was closing, I was performing normalcy. I was giving my family a story that wouldn't require them to acknowledge what was happening. I was drowning and offering them the narrative of a minor inconvenience. That's how well I'd learned the family system by then. I made it approximately 6 steps toward the door before the world became a different kind of problem. The tightness had transformed into something total. My airway was closing with the systematic inevitability of a door slamming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't make sound. I could only stand there, my hand at my throat, and watch the room process what was happening with the delayed comprehension of people who'd never had to consider the fragility of human breath. There was noise. Maggie was saying something. Was she laughing? The sound had that quality, that brightness that suggested she didn't understand the severity, or perhaps that she understood it perfectly and found it amusing. Someone screamed. That was helpful. The screaming made it real for other people. The screaming transformed my medical crisis into everyone else's emergency. I was dying. That's what I remember thinking, with the odd clarity of someone whose brain is being starved of oxygen. This is what dying feels like. Not dramatic. Not like anything in the movies. Just the simple, methodical shutdown of basic function. Just the body refusing to do the one thing it's supposed to do unconsciously. Breathe. And then there was a hand at my shoulder. There was someone moving me, moving past the confusion of guests, moving with the kind of urgent competence that suggested they knew what to look for. I heard someone say, "Does anyone have an EpiPen?" Someone else was asking about an allergy. Maggie was still offering that commentary from somewhere in the room. She's so sensitive. And the words floated past me like they belonged to someone else's emergency. The man who caught me was approximately 6'4", early 60s, with the kind of face that had been professionally shaped by wealth and the habit of authority. I would later learn his name was Richard Castellano, CEO of Castellano and Associates, and that he'd noticed me earlier in the evening because my analysis of the firm's offshore accounting structures had been instrumental in preventing a 7-figure regulatory violation that he'd personally signed off on. He knew my work. He'd told Maggie, apparently with some enthusiasm, that her sister was a rare talent. He'd apparently said this within Maggie's hearing, which was perhaps the moment when everything changed. He was the kind of man who could recognize the early symptoms of anaphylaxis because he'd lost his daughter to a bee sting at age 7, and he'd spent the subsequent 30 years becoming the type of person who kept EpiPens in every room of every building he owned. He was someone who understood that fragility could come without warning, and that the difference between survival and death often came down to moments and recognition. "I've got this," he said, and he was already reaching into his jacket pocket, already moving with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. The EpiPen was in my thigh before I'd fully registered what he was doing. The epinephrine hit my system like an electric shock. My heart suddenly hyper-focused. My breathing suddenly restored. My vision suddenly sharp again. I could taste the aluminum of the injector, could feel the bruise blooming on my thigh, could hear the room coalescing back into sound and sense, and the knowledge that I wasn't actually dying. Not this time. Not today. "Hospital," Castellano was saying to someone. "Now, has she got someone with her? Who's her family?" My parents were somewhere in the room. I could sense their movement, their embarrassment, their sense of inconvenience. Maggie was silent now. She'd finally stopped talking. The silence from her was almost worse than the noise. It suggested she understood, finally, that the evening had genuinely gone catastrophically wrong, and that her role in creating that catastrophe was no longer deniable. Later, in the ambulance, I would reconstruct the sequence of events with the kind of systematic analysis that made me good at my job. The EpiPen had been administered too late. My throat had closed to the point, where breathing was still difficult, still dangerous, and the paramedics were already discussing backup airway management as they wheeled me into the cardiac unit at Mount Sinai. I spent 6 hours in the ICU, my throat so swollen that they'd needed to consider intubation, my heart racing from the epinephrine, my body oscillating between the shock of near death and the pharmaceutical aftermath of emergency intervention. I remember the ceiling tiles above the bed. I remember the sound of beeping machines, the regular hiss of oxygen, the antiseptic smell that I'd somehow only truly noticed in the moment of my own fragility. I remember a nurse checking my vitals every 15 minutes, asking me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, giving me ice chips, checking the IV line in my arm. I remember the doctor, Dr. Patel, a woman in her 50s with a direct manner and no patience for euphemism, explaining that I'd been minutes away from a complete airway closure, that the EpiPen had likely saved my life, that whoever recognized the symptoms and responded was probably the difference between a recovery and a funeral. I didn't have to be told who that was. Richard Castellano had been the difference. He'd noticed me. He'd recognized the danger. He'd acted. And in doing so, he'd created a pivot point in my life that I didn't fully understand until the next morning, when he arrived at the hospital with a stack of documents that would change everything about my relationship with my family and with the woman who'd tried to kill me. Let me step backward. Let me establish the context that would make someone's sister want to hurt her in front of the city's most powerful people. I grew up in a brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, the younger daughter of two people who'd spent their entire adult lives climbing in social status, climbing in wealth, climbing in the particular geometry of New York success that measures worth in dollars and dinner invitations and the zip code of your second home. My father was an investment banker. My mother was on the boards of 3 charities. They were the kind of parents who'd read the right parenting books, who'd enrolled us in the right schools, who'd made all of the correct decisions that were supposed to result in daughters who became lawyers and doctors and the wives of important men. They were also the kind of parents who had decided, very early on, that Maggie would be the one they focused their energy on, and that I would be the one they'd occasionally remember to check in on. Maggie was born when I was 2. She was beautiful in the way that some children are. Beautiful, not just physically symmetrical, but radiating a kind of charisma that made people want to give her things. By age 5, she was being asked to model. By age 12, she was running the social structure of her middle school with the kind of sophisticated manipulation that adults are usually considered too old to attempt. She was good at people. She understood what they wanted. She could make them feel seen. And in doing so, she could make them do what she wanted them to do. My parents watched this with the kind of pride usually reserved for watching someone complete a difficult medical procedure successfully. They funded her confidence. They rewarded her social success. They made clear to her, in 1,000 small ways and a few very large ones, that she was the investment they'd made in the future, and that I was the duplicate copy they'd kept by accident. I was smart. Different kind of smart. The kind that didn't make people feel good at parties. I could look at complex financial documents and see the patterns that indicated fraud. I could read a spreadsheet and understand where money was being hidden. I could look at architectural blueprints and identify structural weakness. I could recognize systems, see the logic of how things were built, understand the logic of how they could be dismantled. But this was not the kind of intelligence that got you invited to the right events, or made you magnetic at cocktail parties, or resulted in people wanting to fund your ambitions. This was the kind of intelligence that made people think you were cold, analytical, slightly strange. By high school, I'd accepted this designation. I became the girl who was good at things nobody wanted to talk about at social gatherings. I became the girl people went to when they needed help with something, but didn't particularly want to sit next to at lunch. The allergy diagnosis happened when I was 13. Severe tree nut allergy, with the particular nastiness of cross-reactivity. Pistachios, almonds, walnuts, cashews, sesame. Not a mild allergy. Not something you could manage with careful eating habits. The kind that required EpiPens, medic alert bracelets, constant vigilance, and the understanding that a single mistake could kill me. My parents treated it like a personal insult, as though I'd developed the allergy specifically to complicate their social life. Maggie treated it like a fascinating plot device. She would occasionally mention it to people, using my medical fragility as a way to position herself as the caring, responsible sister managing her difficult siblings' complicated needs. It was an identity marker for her. I was the one with the allergy. She was the one with the burden of my allergy. By the time I was 18, the pattern was so established that I stopped questioning it. I was quiet. I was careful. I was less interesting than my sister, and I'd made peace with this fact. I went to MIT for my undergraduate degree, studied mathematics and cryptography, came back to New York for my graduate program, and by age 24, I was working for Morrison & Cross, the most prestigious forensic accounting firm in the city. I was good. I was so good that by 26, I was bringing in clients. By 28, I was generating revenue that exceeded what most senior partners were managing. I was quiet about it. I didn't mention it at family dinners. I didn't ask for the kind of recognition that Maggie got automatically, constantly, without having to do anything except exist and be charming. Maggie went to Columbia, got a degree in communications, and had moved into corporate public relations and crisis. communications by the time she was 24. She was good at that too, in her way. She could make bad things look good. She could make scandals disappear. She could make people trust her. She was making approximately $250,000 a year working for a major consumer brand, and she'd been promoted 5 times in 8 years. She was the golden child. She was the one the parents talked about. She was the one who made them proud. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first. It was a dinner at my parents' apartment, approximately 3 years ago, where my mother mentioned that a particular CEO had called specifically to request that I audit his company. It was a moment of inadvertent pride. She was impressed by this, I could tell, even though she didn't quite know what my audit work actually entailed. It was a moment of attention turned toward me, and it was gone almost immediately, replaced by commentary about Maggie's latest success at work. But it had registered. I'd seen it register with Maggie, too. I'd watched her eyes narrow slightly, watched her adjust to the idea that there was something about me that had value, that there was something about me that people wanted. That was approximately when Maggie began paying closer attention to my professional world. She started asking questions about my clients. She started asking about my salary. She started asking, with a particular kind of intensity, about Richard Castellano and why his company had hired me to audit their financial structures. I gave her brief answers. I explained that it was confidential, that I couldn't discuss client details. I was following the professional protocols that had been drilled into me since my first day at Morrison and Cross. What I didn't understand was that I was being studied. I was being assessed for weakness. I was being analyzed by someone who'd spent her entire life learning how to identify what made people vulnerable and how to exploit that vulnerability for advantage. Richard Castellano's company, Castellano and Associates, was a mid-sized wealth management firm with approximately $3 billion under management. Castellano himself was personally wealthy, powerful, and, it turned out, deeply interested in mentorship. The firm's audit revealed some serious irregularities in how certain offshore accounts were being managed. Nothing illegal exactly, but ethically questionable enough to create significant regulatory risk if discovered during a standard SEC investigation. I'd brought the findings to Castellano personally, sat in his office on the 62nd floor of a building that had his name on it, and explained what I'd found. The detail that would later matter was that he'd listened to me with the kind of complete attention that I'd never experienced from my father, from my parents, from anyone in my family who was supposed to be paying attention to me. He'd called me insightful. He'd called my work meticulous. He'd told me that this kind of analysis is rarer than you'd think, and more valuable than people understand. That comment had circulated back to Maggie, apparently through the kind of social network that exists between wealthy people in Manhattan, and that comment had become the seed of the night I nearly died. The weeks leading up to the dinner party at 11. Madison Park were structured around it like a countdown. Maggie had been organizing it for months, a celebration of Castellano and Associates' new marketing initiative, a chance to introduce the firm to a carefully curated group of New York's business elite and media figures. She'd somehow positioned herself as the integral person managing the firm's public relations strategy, which was impressive considering. I was fairly certain her employer didn't know this and would have been genuinely concerned about the ethical implications if they had. But this was Maggie's skill, to create a narrative that positioned her at the center of other people's events until people started believing that she'd actually engineered those events. She'd called me specifically to invite me. That should have been my first warning. In 30 years, Maggie had never invited me to anything. She'd never positioned me as someone whose presence would enhance an event. I was a detail she avoided mentioning when possible. The weird science sister with the medical fragility and the uncomfortable knowledge about how to identify financial crime. But this dinner, she said, would be better if you were there. She said it like it was a gift. She said it like she was finally acknowledging my value as her sister. She said it like she wanted to celebrate my professional success publicly, for the first time in our lives. Castellano's been impressed with your work, she said over coffee 2 weeks before the dinner. I want to make sure he knows that you have family who support you. It's good optics. It's good for your career to have people see that you're not just talented. You're well-connected. That you come from a good background. She was positioned across from me in a cafe in Midtown, dressed in the kind of carefully casual outfit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was leaning forward. She was making eye contact. She was doing everything that her management books probably said to do when you wanted someone to trust you. I appreciate the invitation, I said. But Castellano doesn't really need to know that I'm your sister. It's not relevant to the work. Of course it's relevant, Maggie said. It's always relevant. It humanizes you. It makes you more relatable. You need people to see you as a whole person, not just a functioning brain in a suit. She smiled. It was a perfect smile. It had been tested on thousands of people, and it had always worked. Mom and Dad are coming too. It'll be nice to have the whole family there. To have Castellano see that you have family who loves you, who takes pride in your accomplishments. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't understand that this dinner was about something entirely different than what Maggie was saying. I thought she was being kind. I thought she was finally, after 3 decades, acknowledging that I had value and that she wanted to be associated with that value publicly. I was being naive. I was being trusting. I was doing exactly what Maggie had counted on me to do, which was to believe in the narrative she was constructing and walk directly into the center of it. The dress I wore to 11 Madison Park was black. It was well-tailored. It cost more than I normally spent on clothes because Richard Castellano's office manager had suggested, very politely, that the dress code for the dinner was elegant. I wore my hair down for the first time in months. I wore lipstick. I was attempting to be the kind of person who belonged at the kind of event that required an ensemble. I was attempting to perform the part of someone who fit into this world. Maggie wore emerald green. She wore it like she'd invented the color. She was positioned near the entrance of the private dining room at 11 Madison Park, accepting compliments from people she probably didn't know very well, generating a kind of natural gravitational pull that made the room organize itself around her. She saw me enter, and her face did something complicated, something that looked like satisfaction, or maybe anticipation, or maybe the expression of someone who'd completed the setup of a trap and was now watching the target walk directly into it. "Eleanor!" she called out, with the kind of joy that she'd never directed at me before. "You made it. You look amazing. Come, meet some people." I met people. There was a venture capitalist who'd heard about my work on a fraud case involving a pharmaceutical company. There was a woman who ran a hedge fund who knew someone I'd worked with. There was Richard Castellano himself, who smiled when he saw me, who introduced me to several of his associates, who made certain that I understood that my presence at his event mattered, that my work mattered, that I mattered in a way that my family had never made clear. Throughout all of this, Maggie was watching. I didn't realize how much she was watching until later, but she was present in every moment. She was monitoring the conversations. She was tracking where I was in the room. She was measuring, with the kind of precision that I normally reserved for identifying financial discrepancies, exactly how much attention I was receiving. Dinner was served at 8:30 p.m. We were seated at a long table in the dining room, which was all geometric angles and soft light, and the kind of restrained elegance that comes from having unlimited money and sophisticated taste. I was positioned between Richard Castellano and a woman who ran an investment firm focused on tech startups. Maggie was positioned directly across from me, with a clear sight line to every moment of the meal. My parents were at the far end of the table, doing what they did best, which was existing in a space without fully participating in it. The first course was a delicate arrangement of vegetables and a subtle vinaigrette. I ate carefully. I'd been eating carefully since I was 13 years old. I checked the ingredients mentally as each plate arrived. The chef at 11 Madison Park was aware of my allergy. I'd confirmed this with Richard Castellano's office weeks earlier, had provided written documentation of my medical needs, had ensured that there was a protocol in place to keep my food completely separate from tree nut contact. This was the system. This was how I'd learned to survive. The second course was a soup. I tasted it, and I tasted something wrong. No, not wrong. Not at first. At first I tasted something like almond flour, like sesame. The taste was subtle. It was subtle enough to be almost ignorable. It was subtle enough that I might have swallowed before the taste registered fully, before the fear registered, before the realization hit me. But I'd been doing this long enough that I'd learned to pause, to register, to pull back before committing to a swallow. I set the spoon down. I looked up at the table. Maggie was watching me. Maggie was watching me with an expression on her face that was open and expectant, like she was waiting for something to happen, like she was anticipating a reaction, like she'd already decided what my reaction would be and was simply waiting for me to perform it. "Is everything all right?" Castellano asked me. "The soup," I said. My voice was controlled. This was important. My voice had to stay controlled. "I think there's an issue. I think there's cross-contamination. I think there's tree nut in this soup." Castellano's face changed. It changed from social to urgent. He was immediately signaling someone. He was asking the server what was in the soup. He was asking about the ingredients. And the server, a young man who looked panicked, was explaining that the soup was a pumpkin and almond bisque, that there was definitely almond in the soup, that he'd been told the allergy was nut-related, but that he'd been assured by someone that I could eat it as long as it was a cooked preparation, that the heat would somehow mitigate the risk, that someone had been Maggie. She'd called the kitchen the day before the dinner. She'd asked about the menu. She'd explained to the chef that I had an allergy, but that I was overly cautious about it, that if it was cooked thoroughly, the proteins would be denatured, that it was more about psychology than actual risk, that she wanted to prove to me that I was stronger than I thought, that a little fear-facing would be good for me. The chef, trying to be helpful, had made a modification. The soup had been prepared with almond flour as a thickener, added late in the cooking process, added in a way that would taste noticeable, but be presented as a triumph of hospitality. The intention had been to prove something to me. The intention had been to help me overcome my psychological limitations. The intention had been, Maggie would later explain to anyone who would listen, to show me that my allergy wasn't as severe as I'd made it out to be. The intention had been, in other words, to deliberately expose me to an allergen that could kill me. I didn't understand this yet. I only understood that I'd caught the taste before swallowing, that I'd stopped, that I'd done the thing I'd learned to do, which was to trust my own assessment and act immediately. I pushed my chair back. I stood up. I was already thinking about the EpiPen. I was already running through the timeline in my head. I hadn't swallowed the soup. I'd only tasted it. The exposure was minimal. But minimal exposures could still escalate. My history suggested that even small amounts of tree nuts could trigger the cascade of symptoms that led to anaphylaxis. And I had learned, through years of careful management, that the best response to even the possibility of exposure was to act like the worst-case scenario was already unfolding. "I need to go to the hospital," I told Castellano. "I need to go now." But I didn't go. I stood there for a moment, trying to explain to the room what had happened. Trying to explain to my parents, who were staring at me like I was creating an embarrassment that they couldn't quite believe. Trying to explain to Maggie, who was now laughing, who was actually laughing, who was saying something like, "She's so sensitive. She's literally tasting things that aren't even there. It's just almond. It's not like it's going to kill her." And her laugh had that quality, that brightness that suggested she genuinely didn't believe I was in danger. Or perhaps that she was willing to test whether I was in danger. Or perhaps that she wanted to find out what would happen if I was actually forced to confront the allergy at full strength. And then the symptoms escalated exactly like I'd been trained to anticipate, exactly like I'd feared. The tightness in my throat that started as a subtle feeling became something systemic. The swelling that should have been minimal became aggressive. My body was having a profound allergic response, and I realized in that moment that the exposure wasn't just to the soup I'd tasted. The exposure was to something more, to something that had been planned with more precision than a simple taste of soup could explain. Later, when I had the capacity to think clearly, I would understand that Maggie hadn't just put almond in one dish. She'd coordinated with the kitchen to ensure that the soup was a concentrated dose, that the amount of tree nut protein in that soup was several times what a normal preparation would contain, that she'd essentially created a weapon and presented it as a soup course. She was testing me, She was testing whether I would die. She was testing whether she could actually kill me, or whether I would panic, whether I would humiliate myself in front of Richard Castellano by having a medical crisis, whether I would confirm every dismissive thing she'd ever said about me being overly sensitive, overly cautious, overly dramatic about my own fragility. What she hadn't anticipated was that I would be strong enough to survive it. What she hadn't anticipated was that Richard Castellano would recognize the symptoms. What she hadn't anticipated was that her attempt to humiliate me would instead create the evidence structure that would destroy her. The hospital was coherent only in fragments. I remember the oxygen mask. I remember the beeping machines. I remember being wheeled past my parents in the emergency room and noticing that my father was checking his phone. I remember a woman asking me repeatedly if I'd eaten anything, if I'd touched anything, when exactly the symptoms had started. I remember understanding, with the clarity that comes from the brain being starved of oxygen and then suddenly restored to function, that this was serious, that I'd been hours away from complete airway closure, that I was alive because Richard Castellano had been trained to recognize the early symptoms of anaphylaxis, that I was alive because he'd kept an EpiPen on his person, that I was alive because he'd acted decisively in a moment when other people were still processing whether the situation was actually dangerous. And I remember, as I lay in the ICU bed with my throat swollen and my heart still racing from the epinephrine, a crystalline moment of understanding about my sister, about who she was, about what she'd done, about what it meant that she'd attempted to kill me at a professional event in front of hundreds of people, and had done so believing that I would either die quietly, or I would survive and be humiliated, or I would survive, and nobody would believe that she'd done it deliberately. The calculations were suddenly very clear to me. The pattern was suddenly very visible. The way she'd constructed the event, the way she'd positioned herself as the caring sister, the way she'd isolated me from help, the way she'd ensured that there would be plausible deniability. It was just almond. It was just a culinary choice. She couldn't have known it would be so severe. She was just trying to help me be less anxious. It was all precisely calculated. It was all exactly the kind of manipulation that she'd been perfecting her entire life. It was just that this time, the stakes had escalated to attempted murder. And I understood something else in that moment. I understood that I'd never loved her. I understood that I'd spent my entire life trying to win approval from a person who saw my existence as competition. I understood that my parents had created this dynamic, had fed it, had rewarded her for it, had never once told her that she couldn't hurt me. I understood that I'd been living under a kind of emotional occupation, where I'd learned to be small, and quiet, and careful, and accommodating, because the cost of being anything else was the withdrawal of the love that was always conditional anyway. And I understood that everything would have to change. Richard Castellano arrived at Mount Sinai the next morning with a folder. He was dressed in an expensive suit, and he looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from having spent the entire night coordinating with hospital administrators, with your security team, with your legal representatives. He brought 2 people with him. One was a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd been a bodyguard for longer than some marriages last. The other was a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a Hermes scarf, and she introduced herself as Elizabeth Chen, senior counsel to Castellano and Associates. "How are you feeling?" Castellano asked. "Like I nearly died," I said. My voice was still rough. The swelling in my throat had reduced significantly overnight, but it was still present enough to make talking difficult. "You did nearly die," Elizabeth said. She had the kind of direct manner that I appreciated. No euphemism, no softening, just fact. "You were approximately 4 minutes away from requiring an emergency tracheostomy. The EpiPen almost certainly prevented you from being intubated." "I understand," I said. "What you may not understand," Elizabeth continued, "is that we have documentation of everything that happened. We have video from the security cameras in the kitchen. We have audio from the phones in the planning area. We have witnesses to the conversations that took place when your sister called to adjust the menu. We have the original menu with the almond bisque removed, And we have the modified menu with the almond bisque added. We have a record of the conversation between your sister and the executive chef, in which she specifically explained that you were psychologically fragile about your allergy, and that you needed to be shown that it wasn't as severe as you believed. She set a folder on the bed. Inside were photographs of printed emails. Inside were transcripts of phone conversations. Inside were receipts from specialty food suppliers, showing the purchase of almond flour, with an authorization code that matched the purchasing protocols, for Maggie's corporate account at the event management company, where she'd apparently been operating with more authority than her official role would suggest. This was premeditated, Elizabeth said. This was calculated. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was your sister deliberately introducing an allergen into your food with the explicit intent of causing you distress, and with an apparent willingness to accept the possibility of serious medical consequences as a secondary outcome of that intent. I looked at the documents. I understood what I was looking at. I understood the legal implications. I understood that what had happened to me was not an accident, or a misunderstanding, or a well-intentioned attempt to help me face my fears. What had happened was a deliberate act of violence, framed as care, framed as sisterly concern, framed as love. "What do you want?" I asked Castellano. "I want to know what you want," he said. "This is your trauma. This is your medical crisis. This is your family. I won't make decisions about how to proceed without your input." That was the moment when I understood why my professional reputation was being built among people like Castellano. It was because I recognized systems. It was because I saw how things were constructed. It was because when I was given information, I could extrapolate forward and understand what it meant. And what it meant now was that I had a choice. I could forgive my sister. I could believe her narrative that she'd only been trying to help. I could accept her tears and her apologies and her explanation that she'd never intended for anything to happen. I could absorb this violence into myself, like I'd absorbed all the other small violences of my childhood, and move on. Or I could stop absorbing violence. I could stop making space for people who hurt me. I could stop prioritizing the comfort of my family over the integrity of my own body. "I want everything," I said. "I want legal action. I want full disclosure. I want her to understand that what she did has consequences. I want her to lose what she's built because she tried to kill me." Elizabeth's mouth tightened slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. The civil lawsuit took 6 months to file. It took another 3 months before we reached a point where my legal team felt confident enough in our position to contact my sister's legal representation and discuss settlement. During those 9 months, the following things happened. I left Morrison & Cross and started my own firm with the $200,000 that Richard Castellano offered as an initial investment. I was done working for other people. I was done making money for organizations that didn't recognize my value. I was done positioning myself as a subordinate to people who saw me as a resource they could leverage. I moved to a studio apartment in Brooklyn that was small, but entirely mine. I stopped answering calls from my parents. I blocked my sister on every platform where she had my contact information. I hired a security consultant to evaluate my apartment for safety risks. I began the process of understanding myself as someone whose existence was not contingent on other people's approval. My parents attempted to contact me. They wanted me to see reason. They wanted me to forgive Margaret. She's family. They wanted me to understand that a lawsuit would destroy her career, and that I was being vindictive. I listened to their voicemails once. Then I deleted them. Then I instructed my attorney to tell them that if they continued attempting to contact me, I would request that a restraining order be filed. They stopped calling. Maggie, for the first few months, attempted a charm offensive. She sent flowers. She sent a handwritten apology letter that was perfectly crafted, vulnerable enough to seem genuine, confused enough to seem ignorant about what she'd done, apologetic enough to seem remorseful. My attorney instructed me not to respond. Any response could be construed as a settlement negotiation, which could complicate our legal position. So I didn't respond. I kept the letter in a drawer, and I read it occasionally. And each time I read it, I understood more clearly how much of my life had been governed by exactly this kind of manipulation. The lawsuit was civil, not criminal. Elizabeth had wanted to pursue criminal charges, but I'd declined. I understood that my goal wasn't to see my sister imprisoned. My goal was to see her understand what consequences felt like. My goal was to extract from her, in monetary form, the price of having tried to kill me. The legal team determined that the case was strong enough to ask for $850,000 in damages. This was based on calculations of medical costs, emotional distress, lost earnings during recovery, and the value of future therapy that I would presumably need to address the trauma of having a family member try to murder me at a professional event. When the number was presented to Maggie's legal team, there was a period of stunned silence. Then there was negotiation. Then there was a reality check. Maggie was advised that the evidence was strong enough that a jury would likely award even more than we were asking for. She was advised that a lengthy trial would devastate her professionally and personally. She was advised to settle. The mediation took place in a conference room in a building in Midtown. It was the kind of room that existed specifically for situations like this. Neutral, beige, decorated in the kind of corporate minimalism that suggested nothing important had ever happened in a room designed by committee. Elizabeth and I were on one side of the table. Maggie and her attorney were on the other side. Our mediator was a retired judge with the kind of careful neutrality that came from having spent decades watching people try to resolve conflicts. They should have resolved through honesty and communication, if either party had been capable of honesty and communication. Maggie looked smaller in person than she did in my memory. She was still beautiful. She was still composed. But something had changed. The event that nearly killed me had had consequences for her too, though not the kind that involved almost dying. The company she worked for had been made aware of the lawsuit. The PR firm had not been pleased. The event management company had terminated her employment. Her professional reputation, which had been built entirely on the assumption that she was reliable and ethical and deserving of trust, had been demolished in the process of discovering that she wasn't reliable, she wasn't ethical, and she had deliberately tried to poison her sister at a prestigious restaurant. "I want to explain what happened," Maggie said. She looked at me directly. She was doing the thing she did best, which was attempting to create a narrative that would make people sympathetic to her. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to help you. You've spent your entire life being limited by this allergy. You've let it control you. I wanted to show you that you were stronger than you thought. You wanted to show me that I was stronger by nearly killing me," I said. My voice was controlled. I'd practiced this moment with my attorney dozens of times. I'd learned to present my trauma as evidence rather than as emotion. "You deliberately introduced a known allergen into my food. You did this at a professional event. You did this without my knowledge or consent. You did this despite having documented information about the severity of my allergy. You did this despite having coordinated the plan with kitchen staff. You did this knowing that there was a reasonable possibility that I would experience an anaphylactic reaction. I knew you'd be fine," Maggie said. "I knew you carried an EpiPen. I knew you'd be okay." "I was 4 minutes away from requiring emergency intubation," I said. "I was one specific intervention away from permanent airway damage or death. You didn't account for that in your calculus of whether I would be fine. You simply assumed that a situation you'd created would resolve in your favor." The mediator intervened. "Let's try to focus on what brought us here today," he said. "The question isn't whether the incident happened. We have documentation of what happened. The question is what happens next." What happened next was a settlement offer. Maggie's attorney presented a number, $200,000. It was an insultingly low number. It was the kind of number that suggested they believed I was bluffing about pursuing the case further. It was the kind of number that suggested they believed my family bonds would eventually override my sense of justice. Elizabeth didn't even blink. She simply increased our demand to $950,000 and suggested that if they weren't taking the situation seriously, we should probably end the mediation and move toward trial, where a jury would presumably have stronger opinions about the appropriate price for attempted murder dressed up as sisterly concern. The next offer was $500,000. Then $650,000, then $800,000. And finally, after 6 hours of negotiation, there was a settlement offer of $825,000, which I accepted on the condition that Maggie sign a full non-disparagement agreement, a non-disclosure agreement, and an agreement that she would never contact me directly or indirectly for the remainder of our lives. The final settlement was signed in that same beige room. Maggie signed her name. She looked like she might cry, but she didn't cry. She looked controlled. She looked composed. She looked like someone who'd been comprehensively defeated and was managing it the way she managed everything else, by maintaining her appearance while everything inside her was breaking. What happened to my sister in the aftermath of the settlement was not something I orchestrated, but it was not something I prevented either. The information was public record. The settlement amount was public record. The reason for the settlement became part of the collective knowledge of New York's business community, through the kind of whisper network that exists among people who move in similar circles. Maggie's career ended, not immediately, but systematically. The companies she approached for employment conducted due diligence. They discovered the lawsuit. They discovered the documentation. They discovered that she had poisoned her sister at a prestigious event. She was unemployable in the communications industry. She was unemployable in any industry that required people to trust her. She attempted to go into freelance consulting, but no one hired her. She attempted to rebrand herself by moving to Los Angeles, but the story had followed her. She was the woman who had poisoned her sister. She was the woman who had attempted to kill a family member out of jealousy. She was the woman who had been caught and had been required to pay financial compensation for her crime. Her social life disintegrated. The people she'd cultivated friendships with had only been interested in her because she was powerful and glamorous and worth knowing. When she became someone that power and glamour had abandoned, they abandoned her too. She lost the apartment she'd been renting in Manhattan. She lost the circle of friends who'd only been friends with her as long as she was ascending. My parents had attempted briefly to maintain a relationship with her, but they'd also attempted to maintain a relationship with me, and I'd made clear that the cost of my compliance was their complete estrangement from her. They'd chosen her. They'd tried to convince me that what she'd done was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that could be resolved through family therapy and the right kind of apology. I'd explained to them, with the kind of clarity that comes from nearly dying, that I was no longer interested in their family narrative. I was no longer interested in their version of reconciliation. I was no longer interested in being the family member who absorbed trauma and then pretended it had never happened. They resented me for this. They resented me for choosing myself. They resented me for not prioritizing family loyalty over the fact that one member of the family had tried to kill me. And that resentment was a consequence I'd decided I could live with. By the time a year had passed, I had accomplished the following. I'd founded Eleanor Cross Forensic Accounting Services, operating out of a small office in Brooklyn with one full-time employee and a growing list of clients who valued my work. I'd recovered approximately $4.7 million in misappropriated funds for 3 separate companies. I'd testified as an expert witness in 2 civil cases. I'd been quoted in the Wall Street Journal about emerging patterns in corporate fraud. My professional reputation, which had been built quietly over years, was now becoming actively visible. I'd spent $200,000 on therapy, specifically focused on understanding the impact of childhood favoritism, the way family trauma shapes response to danger, and the psychology of survival and recovery. I'd learned that what I'd been calling caution was actually hypervigilance. I'd learned that what I'd been calling acceptance was actually learned helplessness. I'd learned that the only way to actually recover was to completely reconstruct my understanding of myself. I'd published a paper in the Harvard Business Review about emerging tactics in corporate fraud, which was read by more than 500,000 people and generated approximately $300,000 in consulting inquiries. I'd been invited to speak at a conference about forensic accounting standards. I'd begun to understand myself as an expert, not as a fragile person who happened to have a skill. I'd moved to a larger apartment, still in Brooklyn, but in a neighborhood where I could see the skyline. I'd furnished it with things I liked, bought on my own money, for my own pleasure, without considering whether anyone else would find it beautiful or appropriate or correct. I'd adopted a dog, a rescue greyhound with his own trauma history, who I'd named Thales, after the mathematician and philosopher. I'd built a life that belonged entirely to me, and I'd had zero contact with my sister or my parents. I'd blocked their email addresses. I'd changed my phone number. I'd removed all of their contact information from my devices. I'd ensured that the cost of reaching me would be high enough that they'd understand I was serious. They were part of a previous version of my life. They belonged to the years when I was small and quiet, and willing to absorb damage in order to maintain the fiction of family connection. The final scene is in my office. It's a year and 8 months after the dinner party at 11 Madison Park. It's a Tuesday morning, and I'm reviewing audit documentation for a client, a venture capital firm that's being investigated for potential irregularities in how they're valuing their portfolio companies. The work is complex. The work is precise. The work is exactly what I was designed to do. My employee, a young woman named Catherine, who reminds me of who I used to be before the dinner party destroyed my ability to be naive, brings me an envelope. There's no return address. The postmark is from Los Angeles. Inside is a letter, written in handwriting I haven't seen in years. The letter begins, "Eleanor, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I have the right to ask you to read this, but I need you to know that I understand now." I read the letter. It's approximately 2 pages long. It contains an apology that sounds like the genuine thing, not the performed thing. It contains an explanation of how Maggie's life has deteriorated, how she's lost everything, how she's moved to Los Angeles and attempted to start over but can't seem to escape the knowledge of what she did. It contains a request for forgiveness that doesn't demand anything except to be heard. It contains the understanding that forgiveness might not come, and that if it doesn't come, she accepts that consequence. I read the letter twice. Then I set it aside. I considered responding. I considered whether there was anything that Maggie could say at this point that would change the facts of what happened. I considered whether her suffering now could somehow retroactively erase her attempt to harm me. I considered whether my capacity for revenge was infinite, or whether there was a point where it could be satisfied. And I decided that the answer to all of these questions was that it didn't matter. Maggie's suffering wasn't my concern. Maggie's redemption wasn't my responsibility. What mattered was that I had survived. What mattered was that I had built a life that belonged to me. What mattered was that I had learned to recognize danger and had learned to act decisively when confronted with it. What mattered was that I had stopped trying to make space for people who had hurt me. I didn't respond to the letter. I filed it away in a drawer, and I returned to the audit documentation, and I continued the work of identifying what was hidden, of exposing what was concealed, of revealing the architecture of deception that people built when they believed they could act without consequences. The work is my salvation. The work is my clarity. The work is the place where precision meets power, where attention to detail becomes action, where the ability to see what's hidden becomes the ability to change what's broken. In forensic accounting, there's a concept called preservation. It refers to the principle that the best accountant isn't the one who finds the largest fraud, but the one who prevents future fraud, the one who identifies the vulnerability, addresses it, closes the gap, the one who makes the system stronger by making it harder to exploit. That's what I've become. That's what my life is now. I preserve what's valuable. I remove what's toxic. I've learned that the precision that makes me good at my work is the same precision that makes me good at survival. The attention to detail that identifies financial fraud is the same attention to detail that identifies emotional manipulation. The ability to see how systems can be exploited is the ability to protect myself from people who want to exploit me. My sister tried to kill me. She failed. I survived. I took the settlement, and I built something with it. I took the trauma, and I converted it into clarity. I took the betrayal, and I converted it into autonomy, and I have no regrets. I have no forgiveness in my heart. I have no interest in reconciliation. What I have is peace, which is something I didn't know I was allowed to have until I learned that I didn't need my family's permission to have it. That's the ending of this story. Not forgiveness, not redemption, not any of the things that people expect when they hear about family betrayal. Just the quiet victory of a person who learned that survival meant removing herself from the system that was trying to destroy her. Just the knowledge that sometimes the coldest response is the most compassionate one. Compassionate toward yourself, toward the person you're trying to become, toward the future that you're trying to build. The rest is just living. The rest is just the architecture of a life that belongs entirely to me.